The Planning Committee and I are honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Nell Bolton. Ms. Bolton currently lives in New Orleans with her husband, toddler, and dog. And after living and serving in the Philippines, Nigeria, Israel, Palestine, and many other countries, Ms. Bolton moved back to her home state of Louisiana to help with recovery after Hurricane Katrina. Though she did not expect to return to Louisiana long term, she has loved being back in her hometown where they enjoy the New Orleans culture of celebrating connectedness and community with others. Ms. Bolton just recently took on the new role of Senior Technical Advisor for Justice and Peace Building at Catholic Relief Services, where she promotes the work of CRS, helps form collaborations between CRS and other peace-building organizations, and consults on peace-building projects around the world. Ms. Bolton has an undergraduate degree in religious studies from Rhodes College, and it was after graduation in a serendipitous instance at Barnes & Noble when Ms. Bolton discovered a book on the topic of conflict studies. After realizing that this was actually an academic field, Ms. Bolton went on to receive a Master of Theological Studies from Emory Candler School of Theology with a focus on religion, conflict, and peace, before arriving here at the Kroc Institute to get a Master's in International Peace Studies. Beyond the work that Ms. Bolton does for peace building and CRS, she enjoys going on bike rides with her family, dog included, as well as enjoys baking cookies and making glitter art. I am personally interested in seeing what this glitter art looks like. Ms. Bolton's talk today is entitled Binding, Bonding, and Bridging, Building Blocks of Peace. She hopes that sharing her own stories and insights will highlight how peace requires multiple pathways and must be approached in a holistic manner. Though this may seem daunting, Ms. Bolton is proof that peace building can be done. So with that, please join us in giving a warm welcome to Nell Bolton.
Thank you for that welcome, and I am tremendously honored to have been invited to come back to my alma mater to speak. I think the last time I was up on this stage was during our graduation ceremony from Kroc, and so it brings back a warm feeling. I would like to thank Tori and Leah for the invitation to be here and for all of the hard work to pull this off, and to the Planning Committee for the warm welcome that you've given to me. It's been a really great day to connect with old friends and mentors and to meet some new people and make some new connections who will soon be part of the vibrant Kroc alumni network. Speaking of networks, I just feel like I need to mention to you that many of the examples that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening are really the work of many colleagues around the world. And so imagine, if you will, them sort of standing up here shoulder to shoulder with me. I want to start, actually, by talking about a place that I was first introduced to by a fellow Kroc alum. And it's a place called Tasitolu. If you drive west on the coastal road from the East Timorese capital of Dili, you'll pass this scenic spot known as Tasitolu, or the Three Waters. It's an important place historically, as it is where the country's independence was officially declared in 2002. It's also a popular spot for recreation, with barbecues and sporting events and diving expeditions happening almost every weekend. There's a peace park that has been established there, along with a bird sanctuary and a statue commemorating the 1989 visit of Pope John Paul II. But Tasitolu also represents, in the Timorese psyche, a set of darker meanings. It's a site where occupying Indonesian forces brought residents and freedom fighters to execute them, and where further deaths occurred in the violence that followed the 1999 independence referendum. It became the temporary home for tens of thousands of Dili residents who fled during the political crisis of 2006. The waters of Tasitolu, it is said, have been known to run red with blood both real and symbolic. So between the quiet, marshy lakes and the glistening waves, the air there is thick with the presence of the past. About 18 months ago, I was driving through Tasitolu's thicket of historical ghosts for several days on a daily basis in order to reach the district of Likisa, where I was assessing a domestic violence prevention project. We were examining whether and how the project had changed the ways in which couples and parents handled anger and conflicts. And we were exploring what other factors might influence the pervasive use of violence in the home. And a conversation with one of the project volunteers stands out in my mind. This volunteer, named Alvino, was a wise man who wore many hats in the community, as both a traditional spiritual leader and a catechist for the Catholic Church. For Alvino, the prevalence of violence at the most intimate levels of his community was part and parcel of a much longer historical trajectory. He pointed to the generational experience of violence and trauma through centuries of colonization, occupation for decades, and years of a political transition that sometimes turned violent. In his words, we live in a post-conflict society. There was so much conflict practiced publicly for so long. Of course, it impacts our families. Now we see conflict as normal. People think violence is normal. This relationship between the intractability of violent conflict and the deep psychic wounds inflicted by experiences of brutality, displacement, and loss has borne out again and again all around the globe. We cannot build peaceful societies without healing wounded persons, families, and communities. At the same time, working only at the personal or individual level leaves far too many people caught in a web of structural injustice that continues to inflict harm on their individual and communal well-being. So I'd like to share with you tonight some of the work that CRS is doing to connect the dots between inner healing and social justice. We call this approach the 3 B's: binding, bonding, and bridging. I'm going to start with the latter, maybe the end goal that we're trying to get to. Many approaches to peace rest upon building healthy relationships among and between members of different identity groups and interest groups. Peace in these people-to-people approaches is pursued through fostering greater understanding and trust, along with putting these more positive attitudes into practice through cooperative action to address issues of mutual concern to both groups. Much of the work that I and my colleagues do at CRS is focused in this area, what would be called bridging across social divisions. This bridge building is important work, and I'll come back to it later on in the talk. We've also long recognized the importance of what we call bonding, or fostering honest dialogue and stronger relationships among members of the same identity group, providing safe space for them to hash out disagreements and thus prepare them for effective cross-identity work. But it was my colleague, Myla Laguro, also a CROC graduate, I'm proud to report, and her colleagues in the Philippines, including Orson Sargado, who's here with us tonight, who added an intentional focus on a third key ingredient, which is what we call binding. This encompasses the personal and communal work of self-reflection, self-awareness, and self-transformation through which people bind up their wounds and in so doing find the strength to call forth new capacities for forgiveness, reconciliation, and leadership. Taken together, these 3 B's, binding, bonding, and bridging, are proving to be mutually reinforcing components of building sustainable peace at personal, relational, structural, and cultural levels. We view the 3 B's as an iterative process rather than a linear one, and so perhaps something like this might be a better image for the 3 B's. We also, I should add, do not yet have the evidence to suggest whether there's any particular sequencing of the 3 B's or any recipe that's more effective than another way of ordering or implementing the 3 B's. But we do know that they're all integral to one another. For example, sometimes binding work needs to be done first in single identity groups, yet in other contexts, we've seen that workshops on trauma resilience can in themselves be powerful bridging experiences. What is clear is that, as I said, the elements are integral to one another. I am going to take them each in turn with greatest attention on the two ends of the 3B spectrum, binding and then what happens in bridging and beyond bridging. So, as I mentioned, the first B, binding, creates space for personal reflection and self-transformation. It includes a focus on strengthening emotional resilience through healing and support for recovery from trauma that's already been endured, as well as activating personal leadership capacities to face the present and the future. I'd like to give a couple of examples of what this looks like in practice and how it contributes to peace building. This is an example from Bosnia, where for the past 7+ years, CRS and our Caritas partners have accompanied war survivors on a journey from victimhood to becoming active proponents of dialogue and understanding. This has been focused especially on members of war victims associations, which are typically ethnically based associations, and they're made up of members who identify themselves as being the people who were most deeply affected by the war. They also collectively, these associations have typically been some of the most hardline opponents of reconciliation. These survivors participating in this program go through a 3-part psychosocial training on communication, trauma, and forgiveness, drawing on Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication model, as well as Eastern Mennonite University's Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience program. The workshops use narrative therapy to help participants connect with their own experiences of suffering, as well as to generate openness to hearing and accepting the experiences of others. Safe spaces for storytelling and listening allow empathy to begin to develop. And after a time, concepts of personal responsibility versus collective guilt can be explored. And eventually, groups can be brought together so that the other side becomes humanized as stories of very similar war experiences are shared. In the end, we've seen war survivors' self-concept change, becoming both more positive as well as more inclusive. They come to see that they all, together, are people who have suffered and who have overcome, and their past no longer dictates the future. And after this personal positive change, joint action becomes a possibility. We've seen participants internalize this new unified identity and embrace a spirit of greater solidarity. Those who completed the program have worked across ethnic lines, helping one another to find jobs, collecting money to support peers in financial hardship, and jointly visiting places that they previously considered triggers for their traumatic experiences. That's actually what this photo is of. Each of these men represents a different ethnic group, came out of a different association, and they are spending this day actually going and visiting one another's memorial sites of massacres and other events that happened during the war, and laying wreaths at one another's memorial sites. In one survey, when they came into the program, only 16% of the participants walked in believing that forgiving people from the other ethnic groups was possible. After completing the program, all of those surveyed felt that this was possible, which is really a significant shift and change in their attitudes. In Mindanao, in the southern Philippines, binding activities have included 3-day Understanding the Self workshops, where participants can explore their own traumas, prejudices, and biases, and how these are affecting their relationships. Our peace-building programming there often includes an intentional focus on traditional and religious leaders who carry great influence and moral authority, meaning that if their attitudes change, then they can better lead their followers to do the same. So the workshops, there are also workshops that focus on increasing these traditional and religious leaders' understanding of their own unique role as peace builders in their communities and on the contribution of peace that their spiritual traditions and values can bring. This is actually a photograph from one of the Understanding the Self workshops. These two examples are part of broader peace-building initiatives. So the binding work isn't standing on its own, and it's in fact connected with some of the other elements that I'll talk about in a moment. But even in cases where there isn't a robust peace-building program, we've also found that even a one-day workshop focused on raising awareness of trauma, normalizing responses to it, promoting self-care or stress management, and then just starting to broach the topics of forgiveness and leadership can have powerful effects on personal and relational levels. One example is as a part of a food security project in South Sudan. This kind of very simple one-day training that was done, replicated many times in the community, resulted in the participants not only expressing a greater sense of inner peace that they were experiencing, but also reporting that they were seeing reduced levels of household violence and improved relationships across ethnic lines. One participant put it as the training softened our hearts, and another explained how we were always very stressed and wanted to respond with anger and violence. Even for a small issue with your husband or your child, we would respond by beating our child or quarreling with our husband. Now, when we get stressed, we don't feel so angry. We learned how to control it. Others went so far as to say we do not think of revenge anymore. The training taught us how to build relationships. So this binding work can have really positive and important ripple effects. It's also important when it comes to ourselves as project staff, as well as for community members. CRS recognizes that it's important to care for the caregivers, and so we're working to help our own and partner organization staff to heal from trauma that they may have experienced as well. And this, again, is paying off in direct contributions to social cohesion. So for example, in Central African Republic, project staff who have undergone joint Christian-Muslim trainings on trauma awareness and social cohesion report changes such as this woman on the left, Sonia, saying, "At first I could not live together with the Muslims due to experiencing many negative things. But after this training, I changed. I work with the Muslims, I even go to their houses and I eat with them. The training changed me." She's someone who's responsible for leading savings groups that include both Christian and Muslim members, and in this work, she's coordinating with the local imam. Another example is from a man named Abel, who works with both Muslim and Christian communities to promote free movement. He says, "Before I did not even know what social cohesion there could be in relation to these events. I was very mean. But after this training, I learned that people need one another to live better." Lastly, trauma healing, we're increasingly recognizing the impact of generations of unresolved trauma. We found, and research corroborates, that young people often hold more tightly to the traumas that were experienced by their parents than does the generation that lived through that experience. Evidence also is showing that children who have been exposed to violence have a far greater likelihood of engaging in risky behavior, practicing violence themselves, or suffering the psychological consequences of their exposure. I can share this example from my own home city. You heard Tori mention I live in New Orleans, and for much of the past couple of decades, New Orleans has been vying neck and neck with cities like Chicago for the dubious distinction of being the nation's murder capital. In fact, for 10 of the 11 years between 2000 and 2011, New Orleans had the highest per capita murder rate of any major U.S. city. And the only year in which we did not claim first place was in 2005, when most of the city was evacuated from September onwards. So just as shocking as the murder rate, though, and connected to that, I would argue, are recent survey findings that over half of middle school students in the city's public schools report having experienced the murder of someone close to them. Half of the students, more than half, have had someone they know and love murdered. Nearly 40% have witnessed domestic violence, and their rates of lifetime post-traumatic stress syndrome are nearly 4 times the national average. And yet these same schools are woefully under-resourced to provide psychosocial support. And meanwhile, we have a whole generation of young adults who waded through the floodwaters of Hurricane Katrina, who saw bodies floating in that water, who were displaced and scattered across the country with their family and their neighborhood and their social networks and their education disrupted. And again, I can tell you that very, very few of these young people have received support to process and heal from these experiences. We cannot hope to inhabit a peaceful community with wounds so deep and wide left gaping in our midst. On an encouraging note, this is a little bit of a sidebar. This is not a CRS example, but on an encouraging note, there is a new campaign locally that is trying to reframe our understanding of what's happening with violence and crime in our city, as well as other sort of dysfunctional behaviors on the part of young people. And the campaign is it's a hashtag sad, not bad. And it's trying to share the stories of some young people who may have been caught up in the juvenile justice system and trying to really look behind their, what we see on the surface and look behind at their experiences. So this is a photograph and a little story from a young man named Dominic who talks about his mother being schizophrenic, not receiving care, attacking him with a knife, and there are other instances too in his story. And then his brother being in and out of jail and saying, I never really had a stable home life. So we can't really expect these cycles to end unless we deal with these wounds. So you can, of course, imagine that very similar gaps exist in many resource-poor contexts around the world. So for CRS, an important recent focus of our binding work is with children and youth. This is taking many forms, from partnering with a puppetry organization to help Syrian children who have been displaced to cope with fear and with polarization. In Latin America, in Central America, helping incarcerated gang-involved youth understand how their own behaviors and choices are patterned on gendered social norms and on expectations and experiences that have been passed down through generations. We've got a new training tool out to help young people cope with fear and violence in their lives. It's called Singing to the Lions, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it if this topic is of interest to you. In fact, Laura Milligraf and Susan St. Field from Kroc will be helping us to evaluate its impact. So there was a lot to throw at you on binding. I'm going to move very quickly through the next B, bonding. It'll be familiar to any of you who have done work on prejudice, privilege, and power. And the basic concept of binding is that sometimes you have to get your own house in order and wrestle with some hard truths before you can engage sincerely with outsiders. CRS recognizes that there's great diversity even within a single identity group, and so that makes it all the more important to recognize and motivate the marginalized to find and to use their voice. And an example of doing that is a project in Israel. A couple of years ago, I was conducting an evaluation of this project. The project aimed to build a culture not only of dialogue between Jewish and Palestinian students in Israeli universities, but also a joint culture of civic activism. And a major plank of the project strategy was the formation of uninational or single identity discussion groups prior to bringing the Jewish and Palestinian students together for joint binational dialogue and activism. And some really important things happened in those uninational groups. The Palestinian students spoke of how empowering it was to study their own history and develop a shared narrative of how the past had brought them to this point. And this included a lot of internal debate among the participants because they held a diversity of experiences and perspectives. But the uninational group provided enough of a safe space for them to be able to deal with their divergent opinions in a collaborative way. So rather than silence one another, most of the time, they tended to lift one another's consciousness collectively. And as a result, coming out of that, the Palestinian students reported coming out of that process with a stronger sense of identity and a stronger sense of voice to bring into the binational groups. The picture was slightly more challenging for some of the Jewish uninational groups. This may be partly because they came into the project already sort of with the dominant social narrative already imprinted on them. And so some of them struggled with some low tolerance for dissenting opinions one way or the other. But overall, even for these participants, the uninational groups, they said, provided a liberating space where they could express views and raise questions that were not typically accepted in mainstream society. And maybe unsurprisingly, it was the groups that had the most diverse opinions that reported having the most positive group dynamics. We also learned that a key factor for positive results was paying careful attention to the balance of power. So that matters both in internal groups and in the binational groups. So, for example, one Palestinian young woman reported on her experience of the gender dynamics in the project, saying that there was more space for all participants to speak up. In other projects, our voice as women wouldn't be heard a lot, but here, even if it was in front of guys that didn't agree with me, I could express myself completely. And I think this level of empowerment that she experienced would have been unlikely without the uninational group setting. It also mattered to the participants that the conversation focused on political conversation and real issues. One Jewish young woman said that it is amazing how, over time, our group stood out in our class because of our capability to see complexities, to have dialogue and understand that there is an alternative way to hold a discussion. And then speaking of the binational dialogue that followed the uninational bonding stage, a Palestinian male student agreed. And he said, "In my village, I always talk about the dialogue that we had in the sessions, because it's not normalization or fake. It's not. It's Jews accepting us as we are with our Palestinian narrative as we are. That's what I liked about the project, talking about our interest, what we believe, and what they believe." So, of course, this project did not stop on the dialogue level. It moved from bonding to bridging, in that the participants worked together to plan and implement activism initiatives. And beyond this, many of them became change agents in their own communities. That brings us now to the third B, which is bridging. We've already seen from these other examples that I've shared how binding and bonding activities almost naturally tend to pave the way for bridging. So in the case of the small initiative in South Sudan, for example, I've already shared how those very small steps to address trauma ended up leading to pretty significant intergroup changes, with people not only being more open to interethnic relationships, but actually forming mixed farmers groups, electing one another as leaders of those groups, worshiping together, and so on. And in the Bosnian case that I shared earlier, about a quarter of the war victims who went through the Communication, Trauma, and Forgiveness workshop series have chosen to publicly share their stories at speaking out events, which is what this is a photo of. These events are public events where a multi-ethnic panel of war victims share their stories of suffering. And for many people in the audience, especially for the young people who have grown up in a segregated society, this might be the first time that they have contemplated the possibility that others may also have suffered in the war. So in this way, the speakers are taking their personal transformations and using them as a bridge not only to one another, but also across wider audiences, inviting other people to take a next step towards greater self-reflection and towards reconciliation. A key mechanism for bridging are connector projects, joint activities. We at CRS often find that it's useful to create specific opportunities for groups in conflict to collaborate on issues of common concern. So connector projects are small, locally led initiatives that are designed to address community priorities such as clean water, livelihoods, child care, while also bringing people together across divisions. Connector projects offer a chance to put mutual acceptance and respect into practice, and in so doing, they build or reinforce healthy relationships. And in the context of these relationships, the conflict issues that divide them begin to seem less intractable and more resolvable. The connector projects may sound small. These are some examples from Niger of these are both livelihoods projects. It's a youth metalworking project and a women's marketing project. And they may sound small, but the meaning and the value of these connector projects shouldn't be underestimated. In settings where there's virtually no space for members of different religious or ethnic groups to interact, connector projects can sometimes offer people's first experience of bridging across divides. These are also photos from a project focused on interreligious community action. It's a multi-country project led by yet another amazing Kroc graduate, Shamsia Ramadan. And in the course of this project, there was a woman in Niger who recounted to us how she never would have set foot in a church before coming to a planning meeting for their connector project. And now she feels quite comfortable crossing these boundaries. The women involved in this initiative are reporting that others in the community are clamoring to join in on their interreligious livelihoods project. In Central African Republic, the involvement of large numbers of people from all walks of life in 3B workshops has led to some unexpected influence on political levels. So we've trained more than 1,300 people in the 3B approach to social cohesion. And among those have been government authorities, leaders of the Seleka and Anti-Balaka militias, political party leaders, civil society leaders. And some of these people have gone on to be tapped to play important roles in the country's reconciliation process and peace process. Delegates to prepare the national peace dialogues, delegates to the Brazzaville Peace Forum. And so they brought into these arenas of influence, they brought their 3B experiences, they brought their new self-awareness, their new capacity for openness to reconciliation, their new relationships. And we don't have a way of tracking the impact of that, but one would only hope that this makes a difference to the outcomes of those kinds of dialogues. I would also just add here, this is actually a photo of the man on, I guess, your left, is Imam Idris, whose mosque was burned during some of the fighting. And the man on the right is a leader, former leader of an anti-Balaka militia who, while he didn't burn his specific mosque, he certainly did similar acts and worse in other communities. And in going through this 3B workshop process together, these two men found a place from which they could begin to reconcile and form new relationships. If you're interested in learning more about the 3B experience in Cameroon, my colleague Jean-Baptiste Tala has put together a publication that should be out in a couple of months called The Ties That Bind, Building Social Cohesion in Divided Societies. So I've been speaking a lot about the application of the 3Bs to strengthening horizontal social cohesion or healthy relationships among individuals and groups. I really believe that the next frontier for the 3Bs is also to apply them to transform vertical social cohesion, which is to say the relationship between citizens and those in authority. We see that working along both of these axes, the horizontal and the vertical, more directly addresses drivers of violent conflict such as marginalization, exclusion, injustice. And so in this way, for CRS, social cohesion and social justice are mutually reinforcing components of sustainable peace. They form a virtuous circle in which greater horizontal equity, which we might call social justice between groups, among different identity groups, improves horizontal social cohesion. And then similarly, having healthier relationships among groups improves their willingness to work together to pursue different ends. And so the more cohesive and united that these different groups are, the more willing they are to act together, and the more power they hold to demand accountability and responsiveness from decision makers. As a constituency for social change, they can leverage their collective voice and power. We have seen some promising beginnings in terms of vertical or structural impacts of the 3Bs. So to go back to some of the earlier examples, this is another photograph from Mindanao. And this particular 3B project there was focused on land conflicts. And the evaluation of this project found that the thousands of men and women, boys and girls who had been engaged in 3B activities reported changes in their own attitudes and in how they communicated across religious and ethnic groups. But they also reported that they were seeing changes in the functioning of the authorities and the institutions that were tasked with local conflict resolution. The project aimed to use the 3Bs as a pathway for resolving and transforming pervasive and complex land conflict cases. And there were tangible results that came out of the project. So the same traditional and religious leaders who were mobilized in the project through the 3Bs successfully resolved 35 different land conflict cases. And the impact did not stop with these specific cases. There were also 4 municipal networks and interagency working groups that were formed to increase coordination and find durable policy solutions to common challenges that they were facing. Some of the solutions are quite simple, such as making sure to take going on joint land surveys when there were boundary disputes, and others were focused on preserving the rights of indigenous peoples, for example, by certifying their land tenure even when they otherwise would lack title. Last publication plug that I'll do, if you want to read more about that, there is a policy paper that Mila and I wrote up on those policy impacts of the project. In Bosnia, the foundation that was laid through this broad and deep engagement of different people, including the war victims, young people, and others, in this 3B process of critical self-reflection, intra- and intergroup dialogue, and joint action, has now led to a strategic focus on working with government and political leaders. So far, our current program there has successfully engaged the leadership of over 30% of the country's municipalities, along with key influential parliamentarians and political party leaders, to commit publicly to working for reconciliation. And so the photo on the left is the one I shared earlier. The photo on the right, these are actually 3 mayors representing 3 towns with different ethnic majorities who are also now publicly willing to come together and recognize the suffering of others. We're also working with mayors such as these and around the country to ensure that their action plans and their budgets include concrete initiatives for advancing the commitments that they've made to work for reconciliation. So that includes everything from providing housing and livelihood support to encourage the return of minorities to their pre-war communities, and integrating inter-ethnic collaboration into economic growth strategies. But these steps in Mindanao and in Bosnia and elsewhere, I think, are really just the beginning of what we could do to use this powerful tool for vertical social cohesion. And frankly, overall, I think we've really just begun to scratch the surface of the impact that we can have using the 3Bs as building blocks of peace. What's, to me, is most significant about the 3Bs is their responsiveness to the human condition, to our longing for healing, for belonging, and for community. And so, I go back in my mind to Tasitolu, to this place of contradictions. It's a place that represents freedom and repression. It represents spiritual strength and despair, exile and belonging. And I think this is so powerful because these are all elements of the human experience. Our work for peace has to embrace our full humanity. We as human beings are complex and contradictory, and the societies that we build also hold those contradictions together. But for me, this is not cause for despair. I think that with every generation and in every context, we have to find our way through that complexity, and I believe that the 3Bs give us a pathway and a template for doing so. So thank you for your time and your attention, and thank you again for the chance to be here and share some of these experiences that we've had, and I look forward to maybe hearing some of yours.
questions. So if you want to raise your hand, we'll give you the microphone.
Hi, thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you for speaking. It was very intellectual. And I just have one question about your 3Bs. So I'm a city kid, and I witnessed gang violence. That's what I grew up with. And I was just wondering, when you mentioned about the crime rate in Louisiana and Chicago, I'm from New York City. It's very visible. So do you think that the bridging, the bonding, and the binding could work when it comes to different gangs like the Latin Kings, the Crips, the Bloods? Like, would that ever be a factor that could bridge these gangs together to stop the black and black crime that we witness, or just different minority groups fighting each other when they need to come together to to help each other from being oppressed or to continue being oppressed? That's my question.
I think that I'm thinking in response to your question of some work that I was doing in New Orleans in the period of a couple of years after Hurricane Katrina, and we were seeing a lot of young people who were coming through this program I was working with who had moved back to the city kind of on their own. So these weren't necessarily gang members, but these were people who had kind of come back to finish out their education, who were sort of scraping by a living, but without their family support networks, without their community networks, and began to, were really relying on one another, on peer support to kind of make it through. And there was there still is, a veteran of the civil rights movement who was collaborating with us on some efforts to work with kids who really were sort of trapped and caught up in circles of violence. And the point that he made to me was that in that kind of a setting, he was pointing out to me that with their sort of social support structure disrupted in that way and torn apart in that way, he said these kids are starting to put so much importance on their peer relationships. He said suddenly, without their aunties around and their parents around and other elders to look up to who used to be there in their neighborhoods and on their blocks and aren't there anymore, he says peers become everything. So they're not just friends, they're sort of everything that you look to. And so he said he was seeing these minor disputes, like when a friend let you down, suddenly that took up on outsized importance for these young people. And he said he was seeing people lash out at their peers with violence and in anger over the smallest things. And so I think, I don't want to necessarily generalize that to gang violence, but I think unless we respond to people's emotional needs and their sense of self and their sense of identity and their sense of being respected by others and heal all of the wounds that they may be carrying behind a very tough exterior, I think that's an important part of being able to ask people to then put different value on how they're treated by others in society and how they're going to then deal with conflicts. And I don't think you can take away the other sort of economic drivers of gang violence as connected to the drug trade and so forth, but I think there is a place there for this work. And my colleagues in Latin America are doing work with people at sort of various levels and circles of proximity to gang membership and gang violence, and they are starting to put a much greater emphasis on trauma healing as part of the sort of set of skills that they're working on, in addition to livelihood skills as alternatives and to other life skills and conflict resolution skills. And so I think it could be worth a try, with the right people leading it.
Thank you.
Hi, I am. Great, perfect. Hi, I'm Dania. Great to have you and Shamsia and Myla as part of this community. Really, really proud of that. I had two questions for you. One, caught my attention that this focus on forgiveness, right? There's a lot of thinking around, should we require forgiveness of people who have gone through trauma? is justice required first? What are the first steps before getting to forgiveness? So that's one thought. And the other, as you've made quite clear, there are so many impacts and effects that the 3Bs could be having. What kind of evaluation process are you using to try to get at that? Thank you.
Yeah, so those were two good questions. I think, I mentioned, for example, the Bosnia example. That training module was called Communication, Trauma, and Forgiveness. I think more and more, I think many of our programs are not necessarily trying to promote that people have to come to a place of forgiveness, but rather trying to prepare the ground in which they could contemplate reconciliation wherever forgiveness may fall for them in that personal process. So I think in our binding work, I don't think that it is that I don't see in many of our programs that we're necessarily promoting forgiveness as an end goal or as a specific step that someone should go through. What we're hearing from a lot of people, though, is expressing the changes they experienced in terms of coming to a place of forgiveness, which I think kind of links in with the second part of your question around measuring. This is sort of still relatively recent for us to sort of really name and claim this 3B framework. So we've got a number of learning questions that we're sort of developing around the 3Bs, including, what's unique about ways that it could be applied in interreligious conflict, what is the appropriate, as I mentioned, what is the sequencing and how does that matter and how should that be influenced by different contexts. The evaluation of the 3B project for land conflict in Mindanao was looking at, and this was partly how the project was designed, did the evaluation looking at impacts in terms of level of change at personal, relational, structural, and cultural levels. And so sort of was using those different levels as the rubric through which to seek change. But the methods that are being used are still very common, qualitative methods primarily through interviews and focused discussions. We've used some most significant change methodologies. So there's still a lot, I think, to be plumbed in this. In Bosnia, we are, this is not exclusively connected to the binding and bonding work that could be considered part of a 3D methodology, but we are doing a population-based survey to measure the impact of the program there on sort of broader societal changes in attitudes and behaviors. So we'll see what comes of that.
I wanted to say thank you very much for your presentation. I feel very honored to hear about your experiences, and I always value the work of CRS. So I have two questions. One is a little bit broader. Do you think that the 3Bs work mostly with post-conflict situations rather than in the midst of conflict? Because I kind of saw this trend through your work. And then I'm also wondering about if the 3Bs could be used in Syria. Some of my greatest friends are from Syria. And just learning about the Syrian conflict, there are so many hands involved and coming in from different countries, so many, it's a very tangled web. And I was wondering how the 3Bs could be implemented and if they would only be useful post-Syrian conflict or not. Thank you.
Those are also good questions that I don't have definitive answers to. I can say my colleague Jean-Baptiste Talla, who did a lot of the work in Central African Republic, would say that his experience there showed him that the 3Bs, that there is space to do both personal and communal healing, even in the context of ongoing violence. So he was doing a lot of this work sort of concurrent with efforts to kind of come up with a peace process or a reconciliation plan in the country. And then as there have been continuous waves of ongoing conflict. So I think his argument would be that, yes, he's actually seen space for this. I think that you'd probably have to be have modest expectations of what might be happening at the bonding and the bridging phases, because I think that really has to come from a genuine place for people. So I don't know that you could sort of set forth what that would look like. Similarly, in the Syrian context, again, I don't want to say anything definitive. I can say in that context we haven't been doing as much on the bonding and bridging side, but we have seen just an immense, primarily through some of our humanitarian response work, working with children and with their families, we've just seen an immense thirst for more of the binding support and sort of seeing openness being created through those processes that I think could bear positive fruit. Frankly, even leaving aside any bridging across various sort of sides in the conflict, just the kinds of, in that kind of a setting, the kinds of interpersonal and interfamily conflicts that can begin to develop in those really trying circumstances, I think there's interest in focusing on that among the participants in some of these programs.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Joan. I have a question based on the narrative that I think is often fed to us as college students of spending a lot of time learning about the history of conflict, different elements of conflict, and then going out and sort of giving that to communities that are struggling. And as I'm sure everyone knows, there's a lot of problems with that model of kind of top-down, going to bring our knowledge and our resources out to other communities. I'm wondering how you and your colleagues' work sort of mediates between sharing the resources and the information you have, but also empowering the community members themselves to lead their own process and to lead their own peace building. And also just what advice do you have for college students trying to navigate that tension?
Sure. I mean, I think that's why it's important that sort of a foundational piece, again, I don't want to say there's necessarily one sequence, but I think it's important that a foundational piece of the 3 Bs is this binding piece, which is sort of activating your own personal capacities. And so I think it's important, that's significant to me, to say that we're going to start with sort of having people kind of situate themselves and where they are in their own journey of healing and what they feel like they have to contribute to peace in their communities and what they see as their capacity to deliver that. And I think that if the rest of the programming can sort of flow from there, that's on a very meaningful and real foundation. And I think you sort of named in your question what I would sort of say is behind our approach and is part of the advice, which is I think there is a place for training people in the range of possible ways that they could be involved in better communication among each other. But almost all of our bridging work is really community-led and community-generated. So it's up to people to identify what matters to them and what would be significant in their community in terms of a project that brought people together across divides and mutually satisfied the interests and needs of different communities. So I think that it is possible to hold that balance between offering resources in terms of skills and options and then leaving space for how those are applied in a given community and context.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm just going to try to get to the back. I don't know if I can make it up.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for being here. This has been a really fascinating presentation. I was just wondering if there's any way you could elaborate a little bit on the kind of reconciliation workshops that you guys do, particularly the photo of the imam whose mosque was burned down and the man who had committed similar kinds of violence to that. Seeing them smiling next to each other, something really incredible must have happened to bring them together. So I was wondering if you could talk more about what goes on in these workshops and how that happens.
Sure. So in the case of Central African Republic, as I said, there, my colleague's approach was to use the 3 Bs and then put it together with this process of appreciative inquiry. And so already from the beginning, that puts people on a footing of thinking about what's positive. So it starts at the binding level of sort of asking, like, what do I have that's positive? And then looking at the bonding level, like what does my group have to share in the wider community that's positive, and then looking at sort of dreaming of what can we do together in the bridging phase. And so that's massively oversimplifying it, but I think starting from that place is already kind of a positive orientation. There's a lot of, often in the binding phase, there's a lot of storytelling, there's a lot of processing what's been happening. There's a lot of, in many places, we do a lot of sort of understanding and normalizing different ways that we have as humans, both physiologically and psychologically and emotionally and socially, of coping with traumatic and traumatizing experiences. And then in the case of Central African Republic, there was also a lot done to sort of engage in kind of a joint analysis of where are we now, and sort of like building together kind of a shared narrative and picture of both what's happened in the past, what, on the bonding level, sort of like what happened, how was my group involved in that, how did that affect us, but also what can we do to do differently in the future. And then both in bonding and bridging phases, doing kind of a joint sort of mapping of where do we feel like we are now as a society, and get that kind of creating some sense of a roadmap to be able to say, this is what we need to focus on next, this is what we need to do. The act of doing that kind of work together can build relationships, interpersonal relationships along the way. But that's really very oversimplified.
Will you guys join me in a final round of applause, please?